Hello, everyone. Hello, Philippe.
Hello, Sean. Good to be with you.
Really good to be with you too. I'm really excited for this topic. We talk about leadership, but specifically the leadership of Donald Trump. You're the author of this great book, really great book, which analyzes the leadership of Donald Trump. What hangs in the balance? A case for principled, ethical, competent, and courageously selfless leadership. Um, I, I I didn't finish the book yet. It's quite complete,
Yeah.
but it's really
Yeah.
really interesting because you covered so many different topics in this subject, and I think it's a book that is needs to be read for anyone who wants to learn about leadership, who wants to learn about politics, and also history, because I think we don't see it yet, but I think we are part of history with what's happening right now.
Yeah.
So, but before diving into the book and its content, can you tell us a bit more about you? Who are you?
Sure. I'll start from the beginning. My father was an attorney in the United States Army, and my mother, who is French, was a language teacher. They met in Orléans in France, and I was born in Paris because my father was assigned to the U.S. Embassy there at the time. So I spent most of my childhood in France, Germany, and eventually in Florida, where I studied political science at the University of Florida. Years later, I also studied public policy in graduate school. But after the first 4 years of university, I served as a U.S. Air Force officer for 24 years, working mostly as a pilot, an intelligence officer, a military attaché in the Philippines, and also in the field of aviation safety. I retired from the Air Force about 9 years ago, did a little real estate investment, and then decided 6 years ago to start working on this book.
Mm. And so it's interesting because you have multiple backgrounds to that we can fit in the book. The political background where you studied it, the army background when we can feel your leadership experience from the field, and also the international background because you don't just have a vision on the American policy, but also a more globally more global vision. And you also speak a little bit of French, don't you?
Et oui, un peu. Ma grammaire est terrible, mais on fait comme on peut, comme ma grand-mère disait toujours.
So yeah, I think it is really interesting for this. But so you said you started working on this book 6 years ago. What is the origin story of the book? What made
Oh,
you
yeah.
start the book?
So 6 years ago, on New Year's Day 2019, I woke up and I decided I was going to read all of Trump's presidential tweets, which ended up numbering over 25,000 with the tweets and retweets. But let me back up a little bit. So based on my leadership training experience and having worked with terrific senior leaders in government, generals, ambassadors, it was clear to me very early on that President Trump's leadership was an aberration in both style and substance.
Mm,
So I felt strongly then, and I still do now, that we cannot afford to normalize the kind of leadership we're seeing from President Trump. Um, so in this book, I want people to understand how leaders should conduct themselves and what principled, ethical, competent, and selfless leadership looks like, and how that kind of leadership can really make a difference in the lives of people's subordinates and and the customers of the organizations that they serve in. For some people, this book is going to serve as a primer. If you're early in your career, whether it's in the private sector or in government, but for others, it's going to serve as a reminder, and for
mm,
others, a badly needed reminder, I think. So let me say a little bit about the title of the book, which you already mentioned. What hangs in the balance? What hangs in the balance is another way of saying what's at risk. So what's at risk if we don't have principled, ethical, competent leadership? At the organizational level, for example, what's at risk are things like morale, retention, the ability to recruit, and most importantly and ultimately, mission accomplishment.
Mm.
What's at risk at more of a macro level are things like quality of life and even life itself in some cases. Things like trust in democratic institutions, good governance, the rule of law, national security. There's just a lot at risk, a lot hanging in the balance when we don't have good leadership. Um, with this book, readers can expect a lot of real world stories, a lot of examples of what not to do. But I complement those many examples with examples of people who did conduct themselves in a principled and ethical manner. And often those people were people who worked directly for President Trump. I also bring in, as you've probably noticed, a fair number of contributors, experts who contribute to some of the subject matter in the book. And so the main themes of the book, I would say, are patriotism in the context of what I consider the fundamental responsibilities of public leadership. And then more generically for the private sector as well, competence with respect to organizational leadership and management, the importance of character, trust, and accountability, ethical challenges. And the final section is on service before self, or selfless service, essentially.
Mm. So yeah, it really is really interesting because it seems like you put everything that Donald Trump doesn't have, like principles or ethic, or and it seems like the book is really shown this way, and it's really interesting to have like an anti-case, like an anti-role model to understand what is important, because it shows that, oh, if you do this in a bad way, this will happen, which we don't want. And yeah, it's really interesting. And you said for this you read 25,000 tweets. How did that go?
Yeah, that was I can't remember how many months that took. Eventually, I caught up to. I started with Inauguration Day 2017 and started moving forward. Eventually, I caught up to the live, to whatever day it actually was during his administration. And from there, my day began with reading all of his tweets and retweets. But it really didn't take too long in the process for me to come up with dozens of leadership traits and competencies I wanted to address, because they were just coming through so clearly in his tweets. And of course, the social media posts wasn't the only research I did. I read a lot of reports. For example, the Mueller report. I don't know how familiar some of your audience is with that. The investigation into the Russia investigation and Trump's efforts to obstruct that. Of course, all the impeachment inquiries, the committee that investigated the attack on the Capitol. So a lot of research obviously went into the book.
You said you noticed several traits of leadership. So how do you assess a leader? Like, what makes a good leader?
I would say I assess a leader primarily by what they do and say.
Hmm.
And that's a simple way of looking at it. And those two things, what they do and say, should be consistent. And they should also be principled, ethical, competent. You can also assess leaders by what their subordinates are able to achieve. That's one of the main functions of leadership. And the difference that leaders make in the lives of those subordinates and the lives of the people who are being served by their organizations, whether it's a public or a private organization.
So for you, a leader, a part of being a good leader is also to empower the people who are looking toward that leader, and not just being in command, but also pushing people to the top and making them grow.
Absolutely. Empowering them, mentoring them, ensuring they understand the importance of what they're doing. The work has to have meaning. And you're also, one of the core functions of a leader is also to groom those that are going to replace you.
That's interesting, because it means that, if I understand well, that when you're a leader, you're also preparing to be replaced and to quit in a way. But for some people, they hold onto power. They don't want to go on, don't want to let people to have power too. And it seems that is that the selflessness part of leadership.
That's certainly part of it. Yeah, it goes with that expression that we plant trees whose shade we will never be under. That's the idea of,
Mm,
grooming those leaders that you may not be around to see, but who will carry on the mission and do so well. You know.
mm. And so you saw all those criteria of a good leader, also by analyzing Trump's tweet, but not only because you said yes, you read the tweets, but also documented yourself, and I assume you also saw the news and talked to other people who work with the Trump administration. After all this analysis, how would you describe Donald Trump's leadership style?
Yeah, let me start that with just very quickly highlighting, and some of these themes will come up again when I answer that question. Some of the things that I think make a good leader. So,
Yes.
first of all, they need to respect the institutions that they're serving. They need to promote the core values and principles of their organizations. They need to be a champion of those values. They also need to be knowledgeable about their roles and the roles of their subordinates. And as we talked about, they need to know how to serve and develop their people. You need to be a good communicator, which means communicating with clarity and context, and also with consistency, because that's important for building trust. You need to have character. We'll get to that in a bit. Um, Good leaders also hold themselves and others accountable. They take responsibility for their failures, and they're willing. They put ego aside. They're willing to pass on those lessons to their subordinates, even when it's personal failure. Um, they don't make promises they can't keep, and they avoid conflicts of interest. And very importantly, they operate within the limits of their authority. And finally, good leaders are selfless, meaning they put duty and principle at the forefront of their decision making. So, to your question, um, yeah. So first, I would describe Donald Trump's leadership style, right from the cover of the book, essentially unprincipled, unethical, often incompetent, and extremely self-serving and narcissistic. Um, and there's plenty of evidence for that, clearly. But I would also describe his leadership style as disrespectful, reckless, short-sighted, overly transactional, petty, as you can see from a lot of his tweets,
Hmm.
fundamentally dishonest, undisciplined, divisive, conflicted. When you look at all of his conflicts of interest, even more so now with
Hmm.
Elon Musk being involved in government. He's personally exploitative and frankly corrupt. As Trump would say, other than those things, he's a great guy. So, but to your question, I think you were asking specifically about examples of why I think he's a poor leader.
Hmm.
So he serves as a terrific case study, first of all, in poor leadership, because he provides so many examples of what not to do over such a broad spectrum of leadership competencies and traits, as you pointed out earlier. And I find that examples of what not to do often stay with us longer. They're more visceral. Good examples are often boring. We kind of ignore them, except when
Hmm.
they're not there, and we're seeing bad leadership. At the same time, these examples of what not to do, for me at least, really reinforce what we should be doing as leaders. And of course, I try to spell that out in the book. So to answer your question, I'll talk a little bit about his leadership as a public servant, and then I'll cover some leadership topics that I think are more relevant to the private sector as well,
Hmm.
such as organizational leadership, communication, character, trust, and accountability, and ethical behavior. So looking at Trump in the context of public service, his primary responsibility or duty was to support and defend the Constitution and its key institutions. And he was also supposed to take care that the laws were faithfully executed. Well, you don't do that by conspiring to overturn the results of a free and fair election in order to stay in power, first of all. And he did that through disinformation, through frivolous lawsuits, what was known as the fake elector scheme, and also a campaign to pressure everyone from local election workers in Georgia all the way up to Vice President Pence in his effort to try to overturn the election. And of course, he also incited the violence on January 6, 2021, in an effort to stop or delay the peaceful transfer of power on that day. And did really nothing for hours to try to stop the violence that was happening at the Capitol. You also don't support and defend the Constitution by attacking the independence of the judiciary and the free press, something we've seen in Hungary, for example, recently as well with Viktor Orban. Trump tends to also value personal loyalty much more than loyalty to the Constitution or to the institutions that undergird the Constitution. And as I think I alluded to earlier, he kind of regularly fails to promote the core values and principles of the Constitution. And more recently, if you've seen it on the news, of course, it's amazing it's only been 4 weeks, but his administration's actions have really shown a disregard for the Constitution's separation of powers. You know, we have three co-equal branches of government in the United States, and you know the actions they've taken seem to ignore the authorities that are clearly vested with the Congress, for example. And both Trump and the vice president have made comments recently suggesting that they may not respect the rulings of courts if they don't like them. And all that could lead to a constitutional crisis. Hopefully not.
Yes,
So,
because
yeah.
I think that even if they don't want to, can they legally do that?
No, they can't. And that's why we're at the point where the courts are involved, because a lot of the actions they're taking unilaterally, whether it's trying to fire large swaths of the federal government or trying to shut down agencies that were created by Congress or trying to stop funding that was approved by Congress, those things are very likely illegal, and that's why the courts have temporarily blocked a lot of those actions in many cases. So no, ignoring the court's decisions is certainly not legal.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, to wrap up the public service part of it there. So, I mean, his actions have, as a public servant, have resulted in more distrust in the mainstream media. It's weakened the two-party system we have here in the United States, and it's increased, I think, the normalization of political violence and extremist groups, especially with the pardoning of 1,500 some people that were involved on the attack of the Capitol. So looking more at organizational leadership and management, which applies to the private sector just as much as the public sector.
Because yes, we would assume because he built this persona on being such a big tycoon and being so great at business, and so even if we don't know him well, we would assume, okay, maybe he's not that great of a political leader, but maybe he's still a great businessman.
Yeah, I think a lot of that's a myth. I mean, yeah, he's certainly very rich, but if you look at the number of bankruptcies he's had, and frankly, fraud that has happened with his businesses. I mean, he was found in civil court to be responsible for a lot of fraud with respect to his real estate businesses. So I think a lot of that's a myth. I mean, he was essentially running a small family business with a real estate business. So with respect to organizational leadership and management, what I see is someone who doesn't have much interest in understanding his role as president, at least, or understanding how his organization is supposed to operate. And by that I mean the executive branch and the U.S. government more generally, but that applies to any organization, those skills. And more specifically, he's often failed to understand the directives that govern his authorities. It may be a lack of interest as well, or he's purposely ignoring them. He also does a poor job setting the example, which is, of course, one of the fundamental roles of a leader. And he's also not being a responsible custodian of his position. Um, he engages in behaviors that are harmful to organizations. For example, with hiring practices, he lack of vetting or poor vetting tends to result in excessive turnover, which is disruptive and costly. And his recent hirings are even more problematic. I think I may have lost you there. I'm not seeing you anymore. Are you still there? Well, I'll continue just in case I'm the only one on. Yeah, so he also tends to disrespect and denigrate his subordinate organizations and their leaders, often doing so publicly. For example, okay.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I've got a little internet issue. I'm back.
I don't know if I was still on or not.
You were, so it's fine.
Talking. Okay.
That's the most important part.
Good. So so what I was just saying is, he tended to disrespect and denigrate his subordinate organizations and their leaders, often doing that publicly. For example, he would berate his subordinates on social media, and actually terminated several of them with a social media post, which is not the way you should be doing it. It's something I call no termination without humiliation. And those kind of episodes have a real effect on people's lives. And when he targets people publicly for simply doing their jobs, like election workers, those often result in death threats to those people and their families. He's often retaliated against his own subordinates, and even more petty against former subordinates who don't even work for him anymore. And then, with respect to seeking advice and expertise, according to some of his former senior subordinates, Trump finds it difficult to suppress his personal bias, which makes it difficult to synthesize new information. And he also has a tendency to censor, contradict, and criticize his experts. And those issues, along with his arrogance and his focus on self-interest, obviously has an effect on sound decision making. Communication is another area. So he often failed to communicate with context and clarity, and also with consistency. And what I saw in his tweets especially is that he often communicated through surrogates, where he would repost these outlandish and irresponsible views, later claiming that he was just putting the information out there as if he wasn't saying it himself. But really, when you do that in a position of leadership, you're responsible for what your subordinates say, and for any other message that you're obviously spreading through social media or any other means.
So you're referring to the retweets, when you retweet something I didn't say, but you say, I didn't say it, but also by retweeting or liking it, he's also empowering that message.
Exactly.
And, giving it credit.
Exactly. And sometimes he would do the same thing, not just through government subordinates, but through people who really had no business speaking on behalf of him officially, people like Rudy Giuliani, one of his personal lawyers, for example, who he sent to Ukraine to do things that were not proper and certainly not official. So Trump once described, I think in one of his tweets, his communication or his use of social media as modern day presidential. And I would say his communication on social media was modern day presidential, in the same way that trying to illegally overturn an election might be considered modern day safeguarding democracy. nothing presidential about either one.
Mm.
So moving on to character, I think Trump lacks the necessary humility, empathy, respect for dignity, and discipline and self-control that every leader needs. These are some of the soft skills I think that you talk a lot about. I think
Yes.
you're much more an expert on those than I am. So humility is so important for respecting rules and ethical considerations. Um, it allows us to admit what we don't know and to remain open to different points of view, as well as to change course when things aren't going well. It's important with respect to diplomacy, as I think our European neighbors found out this week. Uh, a bit of diplomacy lacking there. Um, and it helps to build trust, of course, humility. It also encourages accountability and transparency when we make mistakes. It's important for self-awareness. It allows us to examine our strengths and weaknesses. And very importantly, it keeps us from not demanding that to which we are not entitled.
Mm.
Um, Empathy, leaders who practice empathy positively influence the mental health and output of their workers. They tend to retain talent. They increase cooperation between individuals, and they also promote more effective problem solving with teams.
Mm.
And frankly, people who respect themselves and are not going to want to stay in a toxic work environment. They're going to leave,
Mm.
which
Yeah, because
also,
that was something I wanted to bounce back also,
yeah.
is because for some people, I wouldn't say many, but for some people, this characteristic of being strong, being aggressive, being crushing his enemies and so on is a show of strength, and for some people would be a characteristic of a strong leadership. But personally, I don't see that as leadership. I see that bullying. And for me, leadership, yes, has to rely on soft skills and more soft powers um, uh, to empower people. And as you say, otherwise it would be toxic, and aggressivity for me is not leadership. So I suppose that you're totally in that line as well.
Yeah, there are two quotes that come to mind when you mention that. One is, I think, from the former CEO I'm forgetting the company now, but his quote was something to the effect of, "When you have confidence and humility, that's maturity."
Hmm.
And for trademark or patent purposes or whatever, I won't mention the group, but there's a favorite rock band of mine whose lyricist I really like, who talks about how we can be sensitive, open, and strong.
Hmm.
And that's something that really resonates for me. Um, Respect for dignity is also very important because it serves as a barrier against atrocity and cruelty. It makes it harder for us to mistreat each other.
Yes.
Um,
Hmm.
Discipline and self-control, as I mentioned before, are needed for many reasons, including to keep you from avoiding self-serving abuses of power, as we've seen quite a bit in Trump's first term, and we're seeing now at quite a dizzying pace. Um, yeah, Trump's Another thing about Trump is his insatiable need for validation and admiration. That tends to fuel a person's desire for power and success at any cost. I mean, as you probably noticed from the tweets, he's often praising himself
Hmm.
and encourages his subordinates to do the same, as well as the media and anybody else. Um, and with respect to trust and accountability, it's hard to promote trust when you're a walking conflict of interest. When you regularly engage in dishonesty and deception, when you promote disinformation and conspiracy theories. And so Trump's attacks on the facts and the truth, they have real consequences. I like to paraphrase the author and professor Timothy Snyder, who says something to the effect of, when we abandon facts, we abandon freedom, because if nothing is true, then nobody can criticize power. There's no basis on which to do so. And when there's no trust, no truth, then people fall back on belief. And you can't have the rule of law, for example, if you don't have truth and facts. We can't have we can disagree about the facts and what should be done from a policy perspective, but we can't have what one of Trump's subordinates once called alternative facts.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, his disinformation is dangerous because in a democracy, we need an electorate that's informed.
Hmm.
And we need to be able to have rational, fact-based discourse. So disinformation and conspiracy theories can unfortunately create narratives that can weaken those democratic institutions, the very institutions that we rely on for liberty, security, prosperity. With respect to trust and accountability, Trump also likes to play on people's fears. Whether it's fear of migrants or fear of the apocalypse that's going to happen if his political opponents are elected. And that's dangerous because the combination of decreased faith in one's fellow citizens and an increase in fear makes the likelihood of radicalization and violence greater, as we saw on January 6th. He's a divider, he's not a uniter. And he likes to exploit existing fault lines, cultural fault lines. He promotes racial and political stereotypes, and that all leads to more polarization, and ultimately it doesn't help government work better either. And on a personal level, the danger of that also is it creates this division, this kind of ideological segregation that makes it difficult for ordinary people to talk to each other. He's not an ethical leader. He values personal loyalty over loyalty to the Constitution and its core values and principles. And what we're seeing now with the recent hires is that he values, personal loyalty much more than competence, and that's not a good recipe for any organization. So I describe that kind of loyalty as unprincipled loyalty, which is loyalty that's mostly self-serving. It's not related to principle or any particular code of conduct. I actually have a whole chapter about that, what I call principled loyalty, and examples of how that's displayed and how it's not, how unprincipled loyalty is practiced. Trump regularly abuses authority, and he's encouraged others to do so. He engages in many forms of undue influence, and some of those forms of undue influence have risen to the level of criminality. So these ethical violations really have an impact on the morale and effectiveness of any organization. They can also threaten the safety and well-being of employees, depending on the type of ethical violations they are. Yeah, finally, Trump, he only believes in accountability for those he considers his enemies. And accountability is so important in building trust. He's attacked every institution, organization, or person who has tried to hold him accountable, whether it's the FBI, the media, inspectors general in the government, and also judges and juries. And I'll conclude, the answer to this question by saying that Trump's runaway self-interest has resulted in him, violating his oath, abusing his authorities, failing to uphold values and ethical norms. He's undermined the free press, and he's destroyed the career of public servants who are, serving something greater than themselves. And his self-serving nature has also resulted, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, in perversions of justice, like the pardoning of those who participated in the attack on the Capitol.
Well, that's a long list. I'm pretty sure there's more to come, unfortunately. and as you said, he surrounds himself with like lookalikes, the people who are seems to be like him in terms of values and behaviors. And we can see also Elon Musk was really like often admired, especially among entrepreneurs, because he's the richest man in the world. And sometimes I feel like it's hard to find good alternative role models when we are looking for a figure of leadership, and because those people are heavily mediatized compared to you see them everywhere compared to other alternatives. So how can we find good role models in terms of leadership, and not be only exposed to bad leadership such as that we can see with Trump or Elon Musk?
So you mean specific people, or what we can do to find or be better leaders ourselves?
And but first, other people's, but also yes, in terms of examples, how can we aspire to be different and better?
Yeah, so I'll start answering that question by reiterating that I think Trump's biggest problem was that self-interest was the guiding principle, if you can call it that, for his actions and decisions. So what we should instead, again, let duty and principle guide our decision making. We should be selfless leaders,
Mm.
understanding that selfless leadership may require courage. It may also require personal sacrifice. There's something I like to say about those in elected office, that service before self regulates the instinct for self-preservation that can falsely equate personal interests with the public interest. Because if you're guided by self-interest, that personal interest is not likely to align with the public interest.
Mm.
Um, so some examples of selfless leadership, for example, might be prioritizing the welfare of subordinates over your own career progression if for some reason you're at a fork in the road where you have to make that decision. Um, you can also be selfless by admitting mistakes and even admitting wrongdoing, and there's
Mm.
power in that. Um, you can give credit to those who really deserve it. You can practice principled loyalty to a superior you don't like, because you don't have to like your superior if they're ethical and competent, even if they're somewhat incompetent. Especially if they're ethical and they're legitimately in that position, you don't have to like them to exhibit principled loyalty to that person. So that's part of being a selfless leader. And in public service, selfless leadership might also include following orders you don't like,
Mm.
providing that they're lawful, of course. Um, to be better leaders, we can also just focus on being decent human beings. We can do that by modeling empathy and humility in the workplace, by respecting the dignity of others. We demonstrate empathy through communication and perspective taking. We can cultivate humility simply by the act of serving others and by treating our subordinates with respect. And I should highlight that the ability to understand the perspective of others and the ability to respect others are two skills that studies have shown are crucial in determining whether senior managers and leaders either fail or succeed. Those two things. So, we should also embody the core values of our organizations, leading by example. That means that we choose, again, principled loyalty over loyalty to any one person or any one group of people. We should also take the time to understand our role and the roles of our subordinates. Need to understand, how to mentor and empower those subordinates, as we touched on earlier, and make sure they understand the value of what they're doing. Again, we need to hold ourselves and others accountable as necessary. And we should call out unethical behavior, discrimination, and abuses of power when we see it, and protect others from the effects of that. And remember that courage is contagious.
Mm.
Cowardice can be contagious too, but but courage is contagious. And finally, just be the leader who makes a difference in the lives of others.
Yeah, I think that's a great message, and it's really interesting to compare this with the anti example of Donald Trump, and you can say, okay, yes, that's the opposite, and I think it's quite interesting. And do you have examples of inspiring leaders that would be doing the opposite of what Donald Trump does, for instance?
There's nobody in particular that I automatically put on an altar, a pedestal, if you will. There are a lot of historical figures I think we can learn from, people like Abraham Lincoln, Nelson Mandela, and many others. Some more contemporary figures that I admire are the late civil rights leader and Congressman John Lewis, who just died, in the last 5 years, I think it was. More recently, though, there are two Republican members of Congress, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, who defied their political party when they volunteered to serve on the congressional committee that was investigating the attack on the Capitol on January 6, 2021. And those two were patriotic, courageous, selfless, and they believed in accountability. They both paid a price politically and personally, and they knew that was likely to happen. So I think they're a great example of selfless and courageous leadership, and they were certainly both competent as well. Even if before they did that, I probably didn't necessarily agree with a lot of their party's positions on policy, but for their personal leadership, I admire them. And there are many others I highlight in the book, people who spoke truth to power, who didn't compromise their values or the values of their organizations.
So yes, so it's possible to find better examples, even if we don't see them as often. But I think that is the reason why I really believe, especially today in this day and age of social media, AI, that we need more than ever to read. I think that's why a book like yours is also great for really training our critical mind to think about ourselves and to see from different point of view, especially when there's some deep work that has been done. You studied that 25,000 tweets. That's really deep work and not just something that is quick. And I think we need more work like this, and we need to read more. And I think also, I don't remember who said that, but leaders are readers.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and then there are certain people we've been talking about today that I don't think read too much.
True. That was super inspiring. Thank you so much. Is there another message that you would like to share to the world regarding our subject today?
No, other than to say that if you want to learn more about the book, you can find me at philipjohnson.com. Also on, of course, LinkedIn and Facebook and Blue Sky and X and some other things, but philipjohnson.com. Philippe, of course, the French spelling. No, it's really been a privilege to speak with you and share some of this information today.
Thank you so much. So yes, I will put all the links in the description of this video and this podcast episode. And also go onto Google, on Amazon, and type "What Hangs in the Balance." Get the book, read it, and you see it's really, really interesting. And it's a great study case for poor and good leadership. Thank you very much, Philippe, and talk to you soon.
Jérôme. It's been a pleasure.
Merci, au revoir.
Au revoir.